All right. So, from refining space combat doctrines to developing cutting edge capabilities, the US Space Force is really undergoing a transformation right now, looking at tackling challenges like resource allocation, rapid technology integration, and the evolution of the landscape of the space warfare in general, all while also fostering partnerships and collaboration within the military and with commercial partners. And this is what we're going to unpack today during this session. So again, good afternoon. I'm Stephen St. John, currently working as a SkillBridge Aerospace and Defense Program Management Fellow at the University of Tennessee Space Institute here in Huntsville. I have 22 years of experience in the Air Force and Space Force, managing missile warning and experimental satellites. My background also includes electromagnetic warfare operations, controlling nuclear ICBMs, and providing tailored intelligence to both special operations and senior space leaders. Let me quickly recap the series so far. So in part one, we talked about how space is absolutely critical to everything that we do on a daily basis, and really why we had to have a dedicated Space Force to ensure that we could protect it. We also looked at how the branch is organized and why having a specialized workforce is necessary to national defense in space. And then in part two, we presented an unclassified space threat brief that highlighted various counterspace technologies and how our adversaries might integrate those into a conflict so that they can deny our ability to use space as a force multiplier. All right, before we jump into the rest of this, one quick question. Can you please hold any questions until the Q&A session, or go ahead and just drop them in the chat so that we don't miss anything. First off, we'll start with a 3-minute video from General Saltzman, who's the Space Force's Chief of Space Operations, where he discusses how the Space Force is transforming to meet the great power competition challenges. And then after that, I'll amplify some of those specific challenges and opportunities that I think we as the Space Force need to take advantage of in order to continue to stay ahead of our competitors, and why we need partners like you to help us with that.
And over the first 4 years in the Space Force, we focused on some of the systems. We focused on maybe a resilient architecture and the kinds of systems we thought were going to be necessary for space superiority. But we didn't really have the mechanisms to evaluate all the other components that have to be in place. What's the MILCON requirement? What facilities do we need? How many SCIFs do we need? How many units are going to be required to perform that mission? How do these units work together? What's the operational concepts? That is what a futures organization can provide for you. So we are going to establish a Space Futures Command that is combined of 3 centers that starts to ask these fundamental questions, that puts together a force that we can offer to combatant commanders that doesn't just have the systems, it has the tactics, the training, the operational concepts. It is leveraging the right technologies to be successful. The first center will be a concepts technology center. It will evaluate the future operating environment. What's the threat going to look like? What are the technologies that the adversary is going to use and that we need to be able to use? And how is that fundamentally going to change the nature of our operations? How do we combine our tactics into operational concepts? Think about the type of space domain awareness that we're going to have to do out to ex-geo, cislunar. How are we going to do that? As we start to collect data on moving target indications, what's the battle management process that your Space Force will use to make sure that the data from the sensor gets to the shooter on an operationally relevant timeline? This is the kind of thought process that's going to go through this Concepts and Technology Center. And when we have some ideas, we're going to have to figure out whether those ideas are good, whether they need to change, or we need to scrap them. So we're going to build a war gaming center that helps us evaluate technologies. It helps us experiment with new technologies. It'll help us validate concepts through war games, through tabletop exercises. We'll throw away the bad. We'll learn quick. It's a learning campaign to make sure we put all this together effectively. And then the third center, I hope you're more familiar with, because we are going to leverage the work that's been done at the Space Warfighting Analysis Center for years now. It is the data-driven analytics that takes these ideas, puts them through the system, and allows us to use physics-based models, modeling and simulation, high-end data analytics with PhD level analysis that says, here's the right options to pursue. Here's the most cost-effective way to do this. Here's something that can work in this future operating environment. And we're going to take all those together, and that's going to inform our objective force, the force design. What is it that the Space Force is going to need now, in the near term, and in the long term to maintain that competitive endurance?
All right, so here's the roadmap of all the things that we'll go into more in depth as we go through the brief. Okay, so let's start out with what is the Great Power Competition. The Great Power Competition, it really refers to the geopolitical rivalry between the world's leading superpowers. So think the United States, China, and Russia, and how each of those are really vying for global influence, dominance, and strategic advantage. The competition between them spans various domains, so including military, economic, technological, and diplomatic spheres as well. Honestly, I mean, it really reflects a return to a more multipolar world order where all these major players are competing for control and influence over numerous international systems. So that's kind of the broad overview. But I think it's really important to unpack some of these key elements that I've listed below to give you a slightly better understanding of how they might all intersect. So picture a world where the US and its allies are working tirelessly to stay ahead in the race for global supremacy. Their focus is on maintaining military dominance, especially in areas like space, cybersecurity, and nuclear weapons. But also, where China and Russia are quietly but steadily enhancing their own military capabilities with an eye on cutting-edge technologies like hypersonic weapons, counterspace systems, and cyber warfare. Each side is preparing for the future, and neither of them are determined to fall behind. But really, the competition doesn't stop there, right? The battle really extends into that economic arena as well, where power is measured not just by military might, but by economic leverage as well. As shown in the graphic, based on the market exchange rates, the US has more global buying power than China does. But based on purchasing power parity, China can purchase more goods domestically than the US can purchase domestically, which is particularly relevant to military competition because most of that spending is domestic spending. And it's not just about economics. There's a deeper ideological clash at play. The United States stands by its support for liberal democracy and capitalism and values that it believes are key to the prosperity of the free world. But on the other hand, China promotes its own version of authoritarian capitalism, while Russia has embraced a state-controlled economy. And these conflicting political ideologies, they ripple through global institutions, they shape alliances, and they determine who holds the power in international decision-making. But I think the most crucial battle that may lie is in technology. All the major powers are in a fierce race right now to achieve technological supremacy, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, 5G communications, and cybersecurity. These are really the front lines of the new competition. And the side that masters these fields, they will hold the keys to the future, and each power is doing everything they can to stay ahead of the others. And then finally, it's about influence. So each of these global powers is strengthening their position by forging strategic alliances as well as partnerships, whether it's through military cooperation, economic investment, or diplomatic maneuvers. They're all working to shape global policies and secure their place in a world where power is constantly shifting. So amid this, space has evolved from a peaceful domain to a contested battlefield. So for the last 20 plus years, space was crucial to operations against violent extremist organizations by providing intelligence, precision targeting in the Middle East. But now that has shifted. So space has become a central focus of the great power competition. China and Russia are advancing counterspace technologies, as we talked about 2 weeks ago, and challenging US dominance in orbit. The shift from counterspace terrorism to peer competition brings both challenges, but it also brings opportunities to re-optimize military strategy for national security purposes. Okay, the Space Force really faces a critical challenge, and first and foremost, avoiding stagnation. So, in a rapidly changing environment where staying still means really falling behind, like the U.S. Navy's evolution from the Merchant Marines, the Space Force must also transform from a peacetime service to one that is prepared for conflict in space. And as competition intensifies, the Space Force must also adapt to ensure that it can control and defend space as a warfighting domain. So, with the time that I have with you today, I really want to outline some of the challenges that I think we face and the steps needed to secure our position in this new era. Okay, so I know this is an eye chart, okay? And it's really just meant to illustrate how the US military's traditional acquisition process has long been known for its slow and cumbersome nature. It has extensive requirements, testing, approval cycles, and milestones that really make it difficult for the Space Force to integrate cutting edge technologies quick. But in contrast, the commercial space sector with innovators like SpaceX is advancing at a speed that government contracting simply just can't match. So as a result, the Space Force risks missing out on time-sensitive breakthroughs that could revolutionize operations. And that's why, the Space Force is turning to commercial space technologies more often. But this also brings its own set of challenges. These commercial systems, they often differ from military systems in terms of performance, standards, and interfaces, thus integrating them into the military platforms while also ensuring capability with existing systems is not an easy task. Adding to the complexity is the need for testing to test and validate new technologies in an unpredictable space environment. We really must strike a balance between speed of adoption and thorough testing, because rushing testing often leads to failures or security vulnerabilities. But then on the flip side, extensive testing often delays the integration of technologies that are urgently needed. And with that, I think we can all agree that the future of space technology is somewhat uncertain, right? With advances in emerging fields like quantum computing. I don't know if you saw what Microsoft designed with a quantum chip just this week, and it's quite amazing. But also autonomous assets, hypersonic weapons, and space-based directed energy weapons that are actively changing the game for space warfare. But with so many unknowns, it's really a challenge for the Space Force to predict which technologies will succeed and which will fall short. However, it's not all doom and gloom, okay? These challenges have sparked a shift within the Space Force, a shift towards continuous innovation. I see leaders every day fostering a culture of problem solving and collaboration, and bringing together cross-disciplinary teams to generate fresh ideas and solutions. Much like the software industry's shift to agile methodologies, the Space Force is also embracing that rapid iterative developmental cycle. This approach really accelerates prototyping, testing, and refining of new systems and processes, thus allowing for faster deployment while also maintaining the focus on security as well as functionality. Building modular and flexible systems with open standards and architectures allows for smoother integration of new technologies with existing systems. And it also ensures that we remain adaptable as requirements continue to change. So once a technology is developed and tested, ensuring that we can rapidly deploy that technology is really the next step. And the Space Force is working on streamlining those processes so that the technologies can be operationalized without any unnecessary delays. Our focus is on getting mission-ready technologies into the field as quickly as possible without compromising security or reliability. But as we transition to our next challenge, budget considerations are sure to play a big role in this ongoing evolution. So that brings me to our next challenge. As a part of the U.S. Department of Defense, the Space Force is in direct competition with other branches, just like the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Marines for a slice of that defense budget. With so many different national priorities, the Space Force has to make a compelling case for its share, and it's often fighting for resources against other critical needs. It's no secret that we need to stay ahead of adversaries by rapidly adopting emerging technologies. However, the pace of technological change often outpaces budget allocation, and it creates a gap between the demand for innovation and available funding, which hinders our ability to stay competitive in space. At the same time, there's the issue of also balancing investments in older systems with the need for innovation. So upgrading legacy systems is vastly expensive and time consuming, especially when those systems are becoming obsolete and they really just need to be replaced. Yeah, with all that said, though, I really think the real strength of the Space Force lies within its guardians, the skilled individuals who develop new technologies, who keep systems running. So developing a workforce of space operators, engineers, analysts, and acquisitions professionals, it requires heavy investment in training, recruitment, and retention programs. And the cost of specialized education and maintaining a qualified workforce is substantial, but it's also essential for our success. So with these constraints in mind, let's talk about some of the creative strategies that we're exploring right now to meet the demands and so that we can keep moving forward. To address budget constraints, the Space Force has turned to the private sector with partnerships with companies just like SpaceX as well as others. These collaborations, they allow the Space Force to access cost-effective but also cutting-edge technologies without the need for massive and typically slow infrastructure investment. By relying on the agility from those commercial firms, the Space Force can deploy assets faster and more efficiently. Meanwhile, there's a shift in how the Space Force approaches defense procurement as well. Just last week, Major General Purdy, who is the acting Assistant Secretary of Space Acquisitions and Integration, discussed some initiatives like focusing on fixed price contracts, holding underperformers accountable, reducing acquisitions bureaucracy, and the power of non-traditional contracting mechanisms like SBIRs and STTRs, which typically include an academic partner, like you guessed it, you guys, right? UTSI and UTK. And so that's why I think it's really important that we talk about some of this. The graphic that you're seeing right here, it's very simplistic, but what it does is it illustrates how the Defense Innovation Unit has already demonstrated the power of this approach numerous times by rapidly maturing, repurposing, and operationalizing technology from Silicon Valley at the speed of relevance. So it can be done. We just need to start doing it and getting leadership backing to do that. One way that we can do this is to focus on modular or scalable systems, allowing us to deploy capabilities in phases. So for example, a satellite constellation can be launched incrementally with additional features added as funding becomes available. This approach really it makes it easier to adjust to budgetary realities like we're seeing, here in the last few weeks, right? While still advancing the mission. However, at the end of the day, prioritization is going to be key. So with limited resources, the Space Force really has to focus on its most critical missions, such as, these are just examples, space domain awareness, satellite defense, and missile warning, while also deferring less urgent projects. This kind of approach will ensure that essential programs remain funded and we can maximize the impact of every dollar. But the challenges really don't stop there. Space operations need to be integrated seamlessly within air, land, sea, and cyber forces. All right, so without effective coordination, the Space Force is going to struggle to fully leverage its capabilities in support of national defense objectives. If you don't know this, developing joint warfighting concepts and aligning those with multi-domain operations is no small feat. And space warfare, being still in its early stages, it requires the development of new doctrine. Unlike traditional domains like land or air, space is very complex and it's an evolving frontier. So developing standardized tactics, techniques, and procedures for space combat will take time and expertise. And space is a unique domain where we must contend with, space specific factors like space weather, orbital mechanics, and satellite vulnerabilities as well, which just further complicates operations, and it requires extreme precision. Additionally, as the Space Force looks to develop its warfighting concepts, it must recognize the importance of international allies. So coordinating with these partners ensures interoperability and alignment of priorities, which are critical to success in a contested space domain. So I know this all sounds bad, but there's hope on the horizon. All right, the Space Force has the opportunity to lead the development of next generation space technologies like autonomous satellites, space-based kinetic weapons, and AI-driven systems that could really revolutionize space combat. We are also using advanced virtual simulation environments to rapidly test new technologies that allow for quicker feedback and iterative development without the risk of and cost of physical prototypes. So these kinds of simulations, they really help enhance decision-making, improve advanced training, and better prepare Guardians for the challenges of combat in space. But you can't fight without another crucial element, which is space situational awareness. With advancements in sensor technology, AI, data aggregation, and machine learning, the Space Force will continue to enhance its ability to detect, to track, and to mitigate threats. These technological advancements will also improve decision-making and provide early warning for potential threats to U.S. as well as allied space assets. And finally, again, just stomping this one home, is international collaboration remains a top priority. So by working with our allies to develop common doctrine and to establish shared standards, the Space Force can really foster a more secure and predictable space domain. The goal is not only to enhance space combat capabilities, but it's also to set global norms for responsible space operations, thus ensuring a safer domain for everyone. All right, so everything that I've kind of discussed pretty quick is just only a small subset of the challenges and the opportunities that I see from my vantage point. But now I want to shift our focus from my perspective to some of the major priorities that were laid out by the former Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, just last year, and I still believe hold true. Before we start this, the first one is the Space Force has made it a top priority to recruit highly skilled individuals. Especially those with expertise in engineering, space environment, cybersecurity, data science, and intelligence. We're not just looking for talent now, but we're also looking for talent in the next generation, which is exactly why we engage in outreach programs just like this one. And we partner with universities and technical institutions to build a pipeline of future space professionals just like you. So real quick, let me show you this Space Force recruitment video, because I think it really captures the kind of talent that we're looking for and the kind of partnerships with talent that we want to cultivate. And if this gets you excited, let me know and I'll sign you up for the Space Force right after this brief, okay?
You know, space is hard. It used to be all we had to worry about was astrophysics, Kepler's law, gamma rays, solar flares, rocket science, black holes, and the theory of relativity. But now we also track about 30,000 objects, orbiting at over 17,500 miles an hour. And our entire way of life depends on us to protect our satellites from attack day and night. So yeah, space is hard.
All right, so who wants to sign up for the Space Force? Don't raise your hands all at once. All right, but it's not just about bringing people in, right? So the Space Force is also focused on raising up leaders from within. We've implemented leadership development programs designed to nurture young officers and enlisted personnel by giving them the tools that they need to grow into adaptable leaders that are ready to take on future command positions. However, this is also a three-pronged approach. So you don't serve in the Space Force to become rich, okay? So how do we keep the best talent? It's by creating a shared sense of purpose and providing unique career paths that align with personal interest and that bring value to the mission. We're also offering specialized training in advanced space disciplines, career progression opportunities in the private sector, where we continue to send people for 6 to 12-month internships at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, Stanford, Tesla, SpaceX, and so many others. And I know you're thinking these opportunities are pretty great, right? But what will keep you getting up every morning is really our strong culture of innovation that allows personnel at all levels to feel empowered, engaged, and motivated to contribute and buy into the culture that we are creating. So as the Space Force grows and it adapts, we must remain, deeply invested in the research and development of next generation space technology. So our focus is on creating solutions that are reliable, they're secure, and they're resilient for both current and future space missions. We validate these technologies through rigorous testing, evaluation, and mission simulations just to make sure that they meet our operational standards, right? And then once that technology has been proven, the Space Force works to integrate it into our operational systems, ensuring that everything kind of works really smooth. But in addition to cutting edge technology and improving the ability to deploy space assets quickly, we've enhanced our ability to launch satellites, maintain space domain awareness, and deploy counter space capabilities when needed. But it's really not just our military strength. It's not our military strength that plays a key role in projecting influence. It's also both in the military and diplomatic arenas as well. We do this using space-based communication systems that enable worldwide command and control, while global navigation supports military and civil operations. And then space surveillance allows us to keep an eye on potential adversaries. Beyond that, the Space Force is actively involved in shaping international policies that promote responsible space behavior and that define global security norms for space. And finally, the Space Force has a critical deterrence role. So by demonstrating the US's ability to defend space assets, we ensure that that adversaries know any hostile action in space will be met with decisive countermeasures. But ultimately, the mission is clear: ensure space superiority, and if necessary, win any conflict in space. You guys like that GIF? Oh, that's kind of funny. All right. So I know you guys are exhausted from hearing me ramble on. So here's the moment we've all really been waiting for, right? And it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Colonel Lincoln Bonner, who is the Deputy Director of Space Futures Command Task Force. He is a UTSI graduate, and without a doubt, he's one of the most well-educated members of the Space Force, not just because he went to UTSI. Colonel Bonner, again, I want to thank you for being here. If you'd like to take a few minutes to introduce yourself before we kick off things with a few questions, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. Thanks for the introduction. Colonel Lincoln Bonner, I don't know if I've met any of you who are joining us today, but I have very fond memories of my time there in Tullahoma. I've spent 2 assignments at Arnold Air Force Base, once as a young company grade officer, as a captain, from 2001 to 2003, and then most recently during the COVID pandemic from 2020 to 2022. I've been serving, as it shows on the screen, for 27 years on active duty. I started off obviously in the Air Force and transferred to the Space Force in 2022, shortly after I took command of Space Delta 12. Which is responsible for the test and evaluation mission in the Space Force. both developmental and operational tests. I'm married. I have 3 little boys. They are now 6, 9, and 12. I'm sorry, 13. My oldest actually just turned 13 this week. And we had such a fantastic time as a family living in the Arnold Village, spending time on the lake near there, right there near UTSI. And I had an outstanding education, both at the university and the ability to apply it during my assignments at Arnold. And so I wouldn't be the officer I am today had I not had those tremendous chances to learn and grow from all the talented people there. And I owe the Arnold and Tullahoma communities much for my own personal success. I have spent half of my career in space operations and the other half in test and evaluation, both on the air breathing side and the space side of national security. And as well as spending time in strategy making positions in the Air Force and now in the Space Force. One of the things that I'll highlight before I open things up for questions is the period of transition that the Space Force is in. At the conference, I believe the comments that Steve showed earlier from the Chief of Space Operations, General Saltzman, were from the Air and Space Warfare Symposium about a year ago. And one of the things that he described at that symposium is that the Space Force is undergoing a transition from a merchant marine to a Navy. And that is extraordinarily difficult. It is a really big challenge to go from an organization that was purpose-built in many respects to deliver services to one that is responsible for warfighting in the domain. And there are a lot of steps that the service has undertaken to do that, but there are many more to go. And so General Saltzman talked about that change from an organizational perspective, sort of merchant marine to Navy, but there's also a dramatic technological change, right? If I could put that in some context, in 1903 is when the Wright brothers first flew. So that was the introduction of powered flight. And World War I begins 8 years later in 1911 and features combat aircraft. And so in space right now, satellites in many respects they are analogous to balloons, right? They don't really move around the battle space. We launch them and they move into place, and they're fixed assets in most respects. And we are only now, at the moment, there in general are the X-37 and the geosynchronous space situational awareness payload. Those are maneuvering assets. But by and large, very few spacecraft on orbit for the United States or other countries are maneuvering vehicles. And if you think about a shift to dynamic space operations, to intercelestial body operations, such as moving out to the moon and operations there and in between, that creates a very different economic and military set of circumstances for which the service has to prepare. And so a futures organization in the Space Force, its role is really to keep the Space Force ahead of threats and strategic rivals in, from, and to space, right? How do we stay ahead and better anticipate the changes that will come from a rapidly evolving environment? Another example of how that environment is rapidly evolving is, the presence of proliferated low Earth orbit constellations that provide global persistence coverage in ways that we could only achieve just a short while ago from a small number of vulnerable, high-value assets at geosynchronous orbit. And now the same types of activities can be performed by, or are performed by massive constellations or hundreds or even thousands of satellites that make that capability and those constellations far more resilient to attack. And they also create opportunities across a host of mission areas that we are just now starting to really explore and exploit. And so that's just some examples of the kinds of technological shifts and shifts in the strategic environment that are driving the need to really focus on how we bring to bear new technology and the ways of employing them. And so with that, I'll open it up for questions.
All right, Colonel Bonner, I want to kick it off with one little lighthearted question first. So we talked about this, right? You've been stationed in Tullahoma twice now. I get up there on occasion. I haven't got off of the Institute campus very much. So what are the restaurants that you miss most? And then after this, we'll go into more of the other stuff.
So the food is outstanding there, and I do miss it. Some of the places that my wife and my family, that we used to really enjoy, we used to like meals in Tullahoma, as well as a Mexican restaurant in Manchester, El Mocajete, we used to like, and Prater's, of course, for barbecue, for ribs. Those are the places that we used to. If I had to make recommendations to folks, those would be three of the places at the top of my list. There are certainly many others. I can't say that I ever had a bad meal anywhere in Tullahoma.
Nice. All right, well, we'll open this up to more serious questions. I don't see anything in the chat right now. So if you have a specific question and you're in the audience, just go ahead and post that in the chat and we'll present that to Colonel Bonner. But I'll start off with this question to you, sir. So how does the Space Force ensure that it stays ahead of adversaries while adopting new space technologies?
That is an outstanding question. And it is something that we are working to figure out. In many respects, the proposal to create Space Futures Command is driven by the need to do that. One of the things that I can say is that facing a formidable adversary that rivals our own economic might means that technological success is necessary and critical, but it is unlikely to be sufficient. And what I mean by that is when you look back at, say, World War II or at the Cold War with the Soviet Union. In World War II, the Axis powers, all of them had aircraft, all of them had tanks, radios, artillery, aircraft carriers, submarines, radar. And similarly in the Cold War, jet engines and fighter aircraft, long-range missiles, nuclear weapons. The things that made the difference were less the technologies themselves and more the ideas that knitted them together. So certainly, I would never say that if you put horse cavalry against tanks, you should expect to win if you're the one with the horse cavalry. But in a world in which you're facing an opponent that can produce the kinds of technology that are similar to what we can produce and can produce them in numbers, then the difference will become, one, can you keep pace? Or stay ahead? So you can certainly gain an advantage, but we should almost always expect that any advantage from technology will be fleeting, and that the enduring advantages that we will enjoy will largely come from the ways in which we are able to think about and employ those technologies in concert with each other, such that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And so it's going to take the ability to do both of those to stay ahead, both to rapidly adopt technology and to do better than our opponents at figuring out how to bring that technology to bear in the most advantageous ways.
That's a fantastic answer. Yeah, I think, like what you talked about, it's not necessarily always the technology, it's how you bring everything together, right? And you synergize those effects. That's fantastic. I know we got a few questions in the chat. Anita, do you mind just asking those to Colonel Bonner, please?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, Paul Franks has a question about, could you give your thoughts on how the objective force changes over time? Is there a single objective force plan for a particular year? How do you see Space Futures Command's defining a dynamic space force, excuse me.
So as it relates to the objective force, you should think about it as the force that the Space Force aspires to field or to build. And it's important because it serves as a guide star for decisions about organizing, training, and equipping the force. And it is different from the programmed force, right? The programmed force is what the service is able to buy and field with the resources that are provided to it by Congress and the American people. And the difference between the objective force and the programmed force is risk, both risk to that force and risk to our ability to complete the missions we've been assigned. And so hopefully that answers that question about, what is the objective force? And I'm sorry, could you repeat the second half?
Sure. How do you, is there a single objective force plan for a particular year? How do you see the Space Force Command's defining a dynamic space force?
So I would, this is still all yet to be determined. So I don't want to necessarily commit to how the objective force will be presented. But what I can say about it is, at least our thinking is that it will certainly be, it will have some definitive nature or aspects to it, I would anticipate. But I would also expect that, it's going to evolve over time, and that there will be regular updates to it. The timing of those updates, what exactly they will look like, is still something that has yet to be determined. And then from the standpoint of a dynamic space force, I haven't heard that phrase used before. But what I will say is, from the standpoint of, if that is referring to, be the ability of the service to adapt, that is certainly something that we have thought and are thinking deeply about. A recognition that as you embark on any activity to try and stay ahead of a competitor, that there is a cycle, there is a cyclic nature to that. There's an offense-defense cycle. There's a move-counter-move cycle that you always have to be attuned to and responsive to, lest you create an opening for an adversary to exploit.
Okay, thank you.
That's fantastic.
Yep. And you ready for the next question?
Yes.
Okay. Peter Garrettson says, how far out is the Space Force Command being asked to plan? At AF/A8XC in 2004, we were looking to 2050. What are its assumptions about economic development? For example, the original, I'm assuming SFW means Space Force Work Group, looked out to 2060. This looked out into 2025, and then he gives a link to that. And then there's a second part to his question where he quotes Paul Luckley, founder of the Anduril Industries, told Fox News on Sunday, "What is Space Force going to look like in 50 years?" This is the quote. We're going to need to preserve all of the routes between here and the moon. We're going to need to preserve all of the cislunars insertion orbits. We're going to need to protect a lot of asteroids that are far near Earth, that need to be mining for critical minerals, critical resources that are going to power our infrastructure here on Earth. But also we need to expand out into space. So the question here is, do you agree? And I can repeat anything you'd like me to review, and then we'll chunk it out that way.
All right. Thanks for the question. So Pete, I just want to say hello. For the audience, Pete and I, we used to work together a number of years ago when I was first assigned to Headquarters Air Force as part of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force's Strategic Studies Group. And I look fondly back on those times. So Pete, if you're in the DC area, we should definitely sit down and have coffee or lunch sometime. With respect to time frame, the force design time frame for the Joint Force is 5 to 15 years is the time epoch that looks out to. In terms of what time frame a Space Futures organization will look out to, it will look out to whatever time frame we're given. So if we get told to look, out to 30 years, we'll do that. If we get told to look out to 20, we would certainly do that. But barring other direction, my assumption is that we will be working in the force design time horizon of 5 to 15 years. That's defined by joint processes on force design. So for that, in terms of the comments from Mr. Lucky, I'm sorry, I am not familiar with those and haven't seen it, so I'm not in a position to really comment or agree or disagree with them, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. And Stephen, there are no more questions in the chat. Did you want to pick up on some of the ones you got?
Great.
Okay.
So next question we got, sir, is what are the risks and challenges of counter space operations in space warfare?
The risk and challenge of counter space operations in space warfare. I think the number one risk and challenge associated with that is the uncertainty about it, right? Fortunately, we've never engaged in space warfare, and if I personally had it my way, we never would have to engage in it. But given that, that means that what space warfare will look like is largely a matter of imagination. And so that presents its own tremendous challenge, right? And similarly, that as somebody who's been formally trained in strategy, we study a lot of military history. And that challenge is something that, military strategists and practitioners of military art and operational art had to struggle with between World War I and World War II. What was the best use of an aircraft carrier? What would it finally look like? What is the best use of a tank? Should we favor heavy armor in the front and just the most powerful guns, or should we favor high speed and endurance and mobility and sacrifice armor and firepower? Should we have 4-engine, high altitude, long range bombers, or focus on support to ground forces with dive bombers? these are some of the choices that were in front of military strategists prior to World War II and after World War I. And militaries made different choices. And some of those choices proved to be more correct than others, based on, and the proof of that was in the outcomes. And so I think that is the biggest challenge when it comes to counter space operations and space warfare, is that we are in this arena where we are highly dependent on our ability to imagine what the outcomes are. And that makes, and as a result, that really does make wargaming and field experimentation absolutely critical to our success, because that is an opportunity to reduce the uncertainty associated with choices in that arena.
That was fantastic. You talked about strategy in that, right? And so that kind of leads us to this next question. So how does the Space Force's warfighting strategies, which obviously, like you mentioned, we're still trying to get our heads around and develop those, how does it address the potential for space-based deterrence against an adversary?
Well, one of the first things that General Saltzman, that the CSO has talked about in competitive endurance, is denying first mover advantage. And so one of the steps that's been taken and is being taken is to really take advantage of the ability to have many more spacecraft on orbit affordably through proliferated low Earth orbit constellations. And so that does a few things. One, it makes your military capability to achieve certain effects far less vulnerable overall. It also means that if an opponent wanted to truly deny that capability to you, it's going to take them much longer or a much, much bigger punch to be provided simultaneously. And that is also going to require them to devote resources to build that out. And so that buys you time. And in many ways, deterrence is about causing your adversaries to go, not today, maybe tomorrow, and making them do that every single day for as long as you possibly can.
Yeah, I think, one of the aspects too that I think is really interesting that I've heard over the years is obviously, because you have to present a credible capability in order to deter an adversary, right? And so revealing to deter and concealing to win, I think, is one of those statements that I've heard a lot, and just making sure that we, there's been a big push, over the last few years to declassify or drop the classification of certain capabilities that we have in the Space Force, so that we can show the international community what capabilities we have and further that deterrence effort. But obviously knowing that we still conceal capabilities to make sure that if we were to get into a conflict, that we would have the ability to win that conflict.
Right. And, the other aspect to deterrence is also discussed in the CSO's competitive endurance, right, which is responsible counter space campaigning. You're unlikely to deter if you don't have the ability to hit back. Right. So, I've trained in martial arts at different points in my life, and I certainly learned how to block a punch, but I also had to learn how to throw one. And if you can block a punch and give somebody a bloody nose or disable them, and they know it, chances are they're going to leave you alone and go look for somebody else. And so it is the combination of the ability to deny first mover advantage and the ability to conduct responsible counter space campaigning together. avoiding operational surprise. All of those things together yield an effective deterrent.
Yeah, I totally agree. So we're about 5 minutes out from the end, sir. So I'll just go ahead and we'll stop the questions for now. Paul Frakes will try to get with you and see if we can answer some of the questions that are outstanding. But first off, I just want to thank you, Colonel Bonner, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your expertise with one of your alma maters, and also just to spread the good word about the Space Force and where we're headed. So I appreciate you being here, sir.
Thank you for the opportunity. I've truly enjoyed it.
All right, so everybody, this is all the things that we covered today, and obviously, the most value is probably added with what Colonel Bonner was able to present to you guys. So don't really have any time for more questions because we did them all during the Q&A. But what I will do is I'll leave you with this quote, right? So, or it's like a mandate basically. So digital headquarters. So we as in the Space Force will embrace automation, and we will streamline bureaucracy to foster and incentivize data-driven decision-making at every echelon. So I think it goes without saying, by removing manual barriers and harnessing technology that we talked about throughout this brief, we can really create an environment where informed real-time decisions actually lead to more agile and effective operations, and ultimately drive innovation and improve outcomes across the board, right? But we can't do it without motivated partners like you. And so, I hope I leave you with that word of encouragement. And again, really appreciate everybody being here. I hope you enjoyed the third part of the series and found it interesting and informative. And we're excited to have you join us for the next session on March 7th, where we will connect you with industry partners and Space Force recruiters if you're looking to join. I can't sign you up after the brief. Sorry, that was just a joke. And that are looking for the kind of talent that you possess, right? As the space growth opportunities are increasing exponentially every day. I will say Anita is going to send out a survey after this. So if you can please take a few minutes to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it so that we can incorporate your feedback on the next session. So with that being said, thank you for attending, and hope to see you at the next one.